What's up, guys? So this video is part 2 of my painting of Thomas Kinkade's The Bridge of Faith. In case you haven't watched part 1 yet, I left a link for it in the description below. So in part 1, I established the basic framework of the landscape, doing some blending as well as blocking everything in. So in the second and final video, we will dive even deeper into this painting. There's going to be a lot to cover here with the various techniques that I'll be showing you. So I left some timestamps in case you want to skip around with those, but I do highly suggest you stick around for the entire video. And also, in case you do have some trouble painting things like the trees or the vegetation, I made specific videos for each and every one of those, and I also left links for them. Painting something like this can seem overwhelming, but if you stick with me, I can help dispel that illusion, and I'll show you the basic building blocks of how to put this painting together. So let's get going. Let's start off on the top right part here. I'm going to start adding more layers over everything here, specifically working on some texturing of all these trees. I'm using a slightly darker version of the green color here, adding these dark patches all over these leaf clusters. If you've watched my videos about painting trees, this technique should be familiar to you. I left some links for the videos that go into more depth on how to paint trees and foliage. So basically what I'm doing is adding a darker version of the base color because they are going to be the shadows and darker parts of the tree clusters. Use variety with the shape, size, and degree of intensity you apply the brushing. Like I said in my other videos, the more variety the better. In my personal style of painting, I use a lot of dry brushing where I blend colors with the previous layer. So with these white leaves here, I'm going to be adding a bluish gray hue for the textures. I don't want to go too dark because I want to preserve the brightness of this tree. Same idea here, spreading out these dark spots of color. I want to make sure that I feather in some of these colors to preserve the soft appearance of this tree. So now I continue adding more textures to the background trees. Pay attention to how dark you make these patches. Don't go overboard with the darkness of them because as the trees fade into the background to the left, the contrast will be less prominent. It also helps to add a slightly more bluish tone to these textures to help indicate distance. Make sure you don't do a sloppy job at this because the way you do anything is the way you do everything. And any mediocre job you do in this painting is just going to chip away at the overall quality of your finished product. Let's work on these red leaves now. Here I'm going to be more deliberate because these leaf clusters are more defined, so I'm going to be more careful where I paint these dark patches. I'm using a darker version of red and am doing the same thing here. You can slightly go off from the main clusters with a few outliers, but for the most part stay inside these red areas. Notice how I'm not covering up the entire thing, but leaving just enough room to see the previous layer. So once I cover up these tree clusters here, I then move on to the final layers of leaves, where the colors will be the brightest and most vivid. I'm still using a slight variety of green, adding a small touch of yellow here and there, but the main point is to start partially covering up the previous layer. The key here is to showcase the multiple layers of paint because trees obviously have lots of layers, and so using this painting technique simulates this. Also keep in mind to keep the brushing short, precise, and mostly horizontal. I say mostly because once again, variety is important. I don't like using all or nothing rules in painting, especially with landscapes. Since these tree clusters are more in the background, remember to keep the brushing smaller than if you would have the trees closer to you. So this approach to painting these tree clusters is the one I use and will continue using for the rest of this painting. I then do the white leaves. This is the only time in this painting I'm using pure white. Make sure not to go overboard on here because this is already a pretty bright tree. Make sure to leave space between some of the outer leaves so you can see the textures inside the tree. Notice how this tree finally looks more bold and really stands out from the rest of the background. Going back to this red tree, I'm using a slight deviation in the red color, adding a very small amount of magenta. It's also important to practice self-awareness as you are painting. As you continue painting, check your progress. Ask yourself questions such as, are there any areas you missed? Are there any areas that you overdid and need to redo? How does the saturation and contrast look relative to the rest of the composition? Notice how I'm trying to add some softness to some of the leaf clusters here. Try to maintain a balance between that and having some other parts being sharper and more defined. This is what gives a landscape both a solid appearance, yet also having that touch of looking ethereal and misty, and that's especially true for this style of painting. So as I continue painting, I apply the same exact formula for the rest of the trees and foliage. The closer the colors, they're going to be more vivid, so it's important to strike a balance between using desaturated colors as well as the more bold ones. Then, as I go more to the left, where all these plants disappear into the distance, the colors are going to get closer in both value and chroma, so pay careful attention to how you mix them. As I continue in adding the details in this painting, I cover up the reference point as well, since we won't be needing those anymore. Don't neglect anything here, because I think it's easy to do that with painting things in the background. So let's do some work on the dirt road. I'm going to be texturing this part. I'm using a desaturated brown in varying degrees, and am sharing this color between different areas. With the dark areas, I'm adding some lighter spots on this rugged terrain, and in the sunlit areas, this color helps add some dark spots to it. I'm also trimming some of these highlighted areas as well, making them leaner. At the same time, I'm blending the edges of these bright areas with the surrounding dark areas, so that the transition is smoother. The way I do this is with some dry brushing, where I still have some of the residual mixture on the brush that I could feather onto the canvas. Overall, this is pretty much the same thing as with painting the trees from earlier, except this time I'll be using more horizontal brushing motions to maintain the perspective of flatness for the pathway. So when you are painting a flat surface, sometimes it's hard to get an idea of what to paint on there, and this is when using color variety and textures comes into play. This helps create the illusion that there's something more to it and makes it look more solid. Make sure to continue using dry brushing to help blend some of these colors together and leaving some areas more sharp and defined. So now we'll work on the right side here with all these clusters of foliage. We'll be using the same approach here as we did with the trees. You can already see the established baseline colors I did here, so now we're going to be adding some more vivid but also slightly darker colors here. The way these flower clusters are different from the trees is that they are more clustered together, so that you're going to have more condensed painting going on here, whereas the tree leaves are more spaced out and you can see more of the underlying textures. Also, the flowers are not as horizontal as the tree leaves, so you have more flexibility in painting these here. Use some variety with the brushing here. You could add some dark and bold brushing in some areas, but also try to gently feather in some other spots. Once I get enough of this dark color in, I get a bright color and start to layer it over the previous one. I hope you get the idea by now. You can see I'm using the same pattern of painting over and over again with all these different plants that I'm making. I layer back and forth between different color values and adjust accordingly. So now I take a break and go back to painting the rest of the green parts here. You don't have to have that much of an order in painting the objects here, so you do have the freedom to go back and forth on different areas. I'm just painting some shadows here, and notice how the darkest parts are on the bottom of these plant clusters. Pay careful attention to how you create these value transitions here, because at the same time you're also focusing on painting the different shape, size, and intensity of the dark colors. Use different brushing angles too, since we are not painting exact objects but shadows and layers that will be underneath the rest of the plants we will be adding later on. Make sure you cover all the spots here with these chunks of paint. So now I want to finish the section where the road meets the top of the plants over here. Real quick, I want to add dappled light onto the road, and notice how the sunlit part of the road is going to clash with the plants here. It's a good transition that highlights this area. In order to do that, I'm going to have to keep the values light here, and so I have already established some light green colors here where the tall grass and foliage will transition to the road above it. I'm using some thin layers of paint along with some dry brushing to help create this effect. These light green colors will serve as the background colors of the foliage, and I will stack more colors on top which will be slightly darker. Now I'm starting to add the shapes and darker values of the plants in this section. This cluster of plants will consist of a bunch of different things like tall grass and miscellaneous plants, and so with a situation like this, it's good to use a variety of brushing and add some random shapes. Also, notice how the green color here is still pretty desaturated and doesn't really stand out. Same principle here as before. Use some blending in with some spots, but also allow some shapes to retain their solid form. So when I add these orchids on the side here, I'm adding the basic shapes as the background colors. These are vertically oriented flowers, so it's the same idea here with using layers. Except in this situation, we're going to create a very slight gradient effect later on when I finish painting these. So let's go back to adding more layers over the dark areas down here. I'm adding some more green colors here. The green color here is relatively dark, however, if you compare it to the dark shadows inside the foliage here, this color should help create a good transition from the dark to the light. It doesn't look like I'm doing that much right now, but this is a very important time to add careful brushing here, where you have the transition from really dark to really light, where the plants get brighter on top where they meet the road. Another thing I'm doing here is that I'm blending the edges of where the flowers meet the shadows. I want to make sure that this point isn't too sharp, and so I use some dry brushing to take away any unnecessary sharp edges here. So spend some time loosening up any areas here that may look too stiff and rigid. Do a small amount of dry brushing here with some colors here, as well as adding some leaves in the dark areas that could use some more work. Let's take a break from the plants and do some more work on the road. I'm finishing up adding the textures to the road here. Notice how I'm adding some light values here next to the grooves inside this road. Since the light is coming from the left, pay attention to how you paint textures and where the light and shadow meet. Even though the sunlight isn't coming here directly, you still have some diffused light coming from the general left direction, so the light is still going to be oriented from the left. Don't let any surface have a flat two-dimensional appearance. Make sure you cover every square inch here with some type of texture. Now I work on the dappled sunlight here. Just like from before, I'm going to blend it with some color values surrounding it. Keep the margins short because you still want to retain some definition with these highlighted areas. So now let's go back to painting this foliage. I'm switching colors here. I'm going to blend in some yellow with some green and begin blending in some areas here in this transition. These highlights here will be the colors on the front of these plants, and so I'll be using some of this yellow-green mixture to finish painting the lightest parts of the leaves here as well. Once again, same principle here as with all the other plants I've done so far. I paint some individual leaves in some areas, but in some other spots I blend a portion of them with the background. Try to maintain this balance as you keep painting because you don't want this painting to look too sharp. I add some more orchids, this time a blue version of them. And notice how as I add the lighter parts, they have a very slight gradient effect where the lightest part of them is on top and diminishes as it goes down. So I wrap up here and go over any areas that still seem a little flat and finish them off. So now let's add more detail to these rocks. I'm going to add more textures and color here. You can see how the baseline is very monotone, but now we're going to use gray in various ways. Sometimes I'll be mixing in a small amount of brown in with the gray paint, and other times I'll be leaving it alone. If you haven't noticed already, I'm using a similar technique here as with everything else I've been painting, going over the light colored areas with slightly darker values where I add more texture. The thing about painting these rocks and really many other areas in this painting is that there's a lot of loose painting. When you look at Kinkade's painting here, you don't see that every minuscule detail is painted everywhere. Many parts have simple shapes and design, but what happens is that the large variety of color and shapes helps create the illusion that there's more to see. This is what we are doing with the rocks here. We're adding a diverse range of shapes to indicate the textures. Once we get enough of these dark parts, let's switch to a lighter color and add the highlights. I'm adding some light spots here and there, and I'm also doing a small amount of dry brushing so I can feather in some of the color. I have another video that goes into way more detail about how to paint rocks, and I'll left a link for it in the description. So as you continue adding these various textures on these rocks, feel free to go back and forth with the light and dark color values. Painting these rocks is kind of like sculpting them with the layers of paint that we're adding. And remember that the main source of light is coming from the back, so the lightest parts of the rocks is going to be on top. The thing about painting rocks that's different from painting vegetation is that rocks naturally can have different colors on their surface. And so when we paint them, we have to be concerned with two things at the same time. The values of light and dark, and painting the different colors on the surface inside all these bumps and edges on the rocks. Take your time adding these layers of paint, being deliberate with what you add on here. Ask yourself, am I painting the texture of the rock right now, or working on the color variation? The way to make this easier is, of course, just being aware of the value of the specific color you're painting. If it's dark, it'll be inside the shaded area. If it's light, then in the lighter area exposed more to the sunlight. Also, as you paint the textures, use variety with their degree of sharpness. Obviously, rocks come in different types of sharpness, so create some edges that are smooth, and some of them sharper and more defined. So this is a crash course on painting rocks in this video, and we'll be using the same formula for all of them in this painting. If you do find yourself struggling with this part, I highly recommend watching my video on how to paint rocks, which I left a link for in the description. Let's take a break from this part and work on something else. I think I've shown you enough here to where we can finish this later. Now let's do some work on the stone bridge. I get myself the fine detailer brush and use a gray mixture to start to add in the mortar in between these stones. For this, you're going to want to keep the mixture wet all the time, so you'll find yourself going back and forth between the palette and the canvas more often than before. This is a pretty easy part, but one thing to remember is to slightly lighten up this gray mixture when you paint this part closer to the top of the bridge. The light will be slightly more diffused near the top part as opposed to the bottom. So now let's elaborate more on these individual stones. I'm going to add some more color variety and add a small amount of texture here. We already have a good foundation here that I have already established, and so now I'm going to be using a variety of color to help make these look more three-dimensional. Since the light is going to be coming from above, the lightest parts of the rocks will be generally on top and then get very slightly darker on the bottom of each stone in this bridge. The colors I'm using are brown, magenta, blue, and gray. I'm making sure all these colors are desaturated to the point where it can look realistic. This is especially true for the magenta because this is a very vivid color and you're going to want to make sure to dial down with some gray or brown. Now I work on adding some shading on the bottom of each stone. I use a darker mixture here and carefully blend it on the bottom of each rock. Notice how the stones are starting to look more solid and defined. Spend some time doing this and you can go back and forth as many times as you feel the need. Also, don't go too dark because you're not painting the entire rock here, because these stones are already somewhat flat since they are walled in to create this bridge. Now I go back to work some more on the mortar. I lighten up my gray mixture and go over the areas that need some more light color values. I think you get the idea here. Since there's so little layering involved here, I'm free to go back and forth as I please and work on all these different elements until I am able to finish this section. Let's work on finishing the vegetation in front of this stone bridge. When you are painting the plants in front of something, make sure that the top parts of the vegetation is slightly blended with the background, because otherwise it will look too stiff and rigid. Once again, remember how we are trying to strike a balance between having blended elements in this painting along with the more sharp and defined features as well. So now I'm working on a few miscellaneous parts of this painting, working some more on the rocks by the river, and notice how this area overall is really starting to take shape. You can start to see how all those layers of paint we added are coming together, from the vegetation to the rocks, and how the different color values transition from light to dark. But don't get too comfortable yet, we are not even close to being done. I have several more things I want to show you, and one that I had made a huge mistake on in the previous video, so I want to make sure that you stick around and see where I went wrong. So as I continue painting these rocks, I'm spending most of my time doing the same things over and over again. I'm texturizing the rocks more with various tones of gray and layering on top the darks and the lights. These rocks are really starting to take shape, and you can see the results of how this process of layering can sculpt these rocks into the way they look now. I always advise you to take frequent breaks from painting the same thing for too long and switch over to painting another part of the painting. This helps to break the routine and give you a fresh set of eyes consistently throughout the painting process. Let's do some more work on the grassy area here. I already got a lot done in the first video, and so here I want to add the finishing touches. I'm first going to add a basic green mixture over some highlighted areas here. Even though we are painting grass here, the same basic principles apply. Layering a dark mixture over the light mixture, and then layering on top of that the brightest and most colorful mixture. I'm not painting grass blades yet. What I'm doing is painting the areas where the shadows and darker parts of the grass is going to be inside these highlighted areas. So what you want to do here is, when you apply this color, use some dry brushing to help blend it with the background. This section of the original painting by Kinkade has generally loose painting, so the pressure to paint every single blade of grass isn't there. But since I am a perfectionist, I still want to use some precision later on when we finish the details here. So with the same mixture, I could share this with other parts over here. I can use the same color to add some more lighter areas in the very dark spots. The one thing you don't want to do when painting grass is keeping the color monotone. If you use the same color scheme for the grass, it's going to end up looking flat. Using color variety is important, just like with anything else in a landscape painting. So I switched my green mixture slightly to a more olive color and apply some more shading in the highlighted areas just like before. Look out for any areas where the color is too solid. Add some texture to those areas so that every square inch is covered. And also, don't forget to keep the brushing trending towards a vertical orientation. The reason is pretty obvious, since this time we are not painting leaves or foliage. And once again, I use the same mixture to highlight some of the dark areas and add more color variety. So when I'm done with that, I switch over to my fine detailer brush and start to paint the grass blades. Keep this mixture wet at all times so you can have the most precision in painting this. And when you brush on the canvas, don't use the same brushing motion either. Go up to down as well as brushing from down to upward. Don't paint them too straight either. It's easy to go overboard on this part since you're painting a whole bunch of grass blades, but try to keep them separated and have them try to stand out from the background. In the darker spots, you could darken the mixture, but even here, make sure that the grass blades still stand out from the background. Don't rush painting this, because it's easy to think that just because you're painting a simple object like this, that you could paint it fast, but you need to make sure that you use accuracy here. Keep going back to the palette and water to keep the brush sharp at all times. Also, don't forget to paint the grass blades that overlap the bottom of the rocks. I hope you get the idea. I'm going to come back here later to finish this section, but I think I showed you enough here to get an idea of what to do. So now let's elaborate more on the pathway over the stone bridge. This part will be very similar to how we were working on the pathway earlier in the video. The thing that's going to be different here is that there will be some stones embedded into the pathway, and so we will have to paint these along with the texture on the road. This part of the bridge is where the stones on top of the bridge transition from the dirt path that leads to this bridge, and so as we go more to the right, the dirt path will disappear and will be replaced by the stones that create this pathway. Another thing is that we will be using more gray paint here, as this part has a more dominant grayish tone instead of a desaturated brown. Once again, keep the brushing trending towards a horizontal orientation. We will be doing two things at the same time here. Adding the lighter parts of the texture here, as well as paint some curved shapes to signify the rocks that are integrated into this pathway. Let's take a break from that and work on the dappled sunlight spots. In the previous video, I overdid the orange parts here, and looking back, I should have used less of the orange paint to outline these parts. Right now, we're going to fix that. But first, let me add a second coat of orange in the areas that I actually do want to keep. This time the orange color is more desaturated, so it doesn't stand out as much. I'm also moving inward as well, so that there is less of the white areas, and I'm using this orange mixture to be part of the texture inside these white spots. Be careful with how much you add here, because these sunspots will have small margins of transition as they blend into the darker area surrounding them. Then I switch my paint mixture to the gray color of the road and start to integrate this with the edges of these sunspots. Pay careful attention here because you will be doing multiple things at once. You're going to paint the color transition between the dark and light values. You're also going to be continuing to add texture, and you're creating a transition of color hue as well. So after this, I add a second coat of white over the brightest parts. Be careful not to overdo it here, as there still is going to be a small amount of texture inside these areas. After that, I go back with a very slightly darker mixture and finish adding the textures in these bright areas. It's a mix of white, orange, and brown, which helps desaturate the orange. Notice how much different these dappled sunlit areas look now. They're still bright, except they look more well integrated into the painting now. Now let's do some more work on the darker part of the road. I get a dark gray mixture and start to paint the outlines of these rocks. Mind you, these are just the bottom parts of the rocks, so these are going to be narrow strips of paint that outline the edges of the rock. Use variety with the shapes and sizes. You can also use the same color mixture to add some textures here and there too. Also, don't forget that as you go more to the right, the bridge will get further away from the viewer, so make sure you adjust the size of these shapes accordingly as you progress painting these different patterns. They will diminish in size as we go more to the right. So you can start to see what's going on here as I continue adding texture on this road. We have an assortment of color and values, but they are really not that far apart from each other in terms of difference in intensity. Just lots of different shades of gray and small amounts of brown. I think I've shown enough here to get an idea of what to do when you paint this road. Let's move on. Now I'm moving to the background here, and I'm going to work on several different things. Pay attention to the colors that you mix on the palette. All of the colors I'll be using here will be very desaturated, and also when you mix it on the palette, use more white paint than you would think, because many times the color actually turns out darker than you think. What I'm doing here is adding another coat of paint over a few areas here to make the colors look more solid and integrated with this background. Even though these background colors are very close to each other in chroma and value, I still want to make sure that we have some good quality textures going on here in all those trees in the background. Next, I'll work on the leaves here. In the last video, I established the main shapes of these leaf clusters, and so I want to come back here and do some blending. I'm getting the same desaturated green color and I'm carefully blending the edges of some of the leaves with the background. Don't go overboard with the blending here. We want to retain as many individual leaves as possible over here. In something like this, you want to use thin layers of paint, especially since the background is really bright and we want to make sure the transition between that and these leaf clusters is as smooth as possible. Now let's add some more foliage into this part right here. I'm using a very desaturated magenta color to add this tree over here. This part of the painting has lots of contrast because of the bright white sunlight right behind all these leaves, and so we're going to be careful with how we paint this section. This magenta color will need to properly transition to this white background, so pay close attention to your color mixture and dry brushing when you start to blend the top of this tree with the white colors. Then I add a second coat of white paint over this part, and notice how much of a difference it makes. It looks brighter than before. Then I work on transitioning the green leaves on top with this white background. I get a light desaturated green mixture and add a few more leaf clusters here. Be careful with how much you put on here because we want to preserve as much of this white background as possible. Now we can see how this part of the painting looks more bold and dramatic, with that bright sunlight coming through with this opening between all these leaves. And then we have all those dark parts above this area. This is part of Kinkade's signature style, using bold contrast like this really to make this landscape painting stand out. Then I do some more miscellaneous work on various parts, adding more textures here and there, giving more plants a solid appearance. Pay close attention to your color values here, because there's a lot of contrast going on in this section. Also, this background has details in it that can be easily overlooked. Be careful not to be negligent here because it's easy to just splash on a bunch of bright and desaturated colors into the background for its own sake, but we still have a good amount of detail to make sure that we take care of. Use the reference photo a lot, getting to know the placement of things like the different types of plants in the background. Make sure every square inch of this part doesn't look too flat by adding some texture to it, even when it's far away and blends along with the rest of the background. Okay, so now I want to show you guys something. This pink tree here is going to have to be redone. I made a video a while back on how to paint a tree like Thomas Kinkade, but looking back at it now, I see how I can improve on this tree. But first, what I want to do is erase a bunch of these leaves so we can partially repaint this section. In order to do that, I'm getting a dark green mixture and painting over many of the old areas of this tree so that we can repaint most of this tree. I'm still going to use the same principles as I did before, but this time I want to sharpen things up more. I want to paint this tree with more detail on the leaves along with a better integration of them with the background. So once I feel like I added enough chunks of this dark green color on here, I then do what I have been doing with all my other trees in this video. I add a slightly desaturated magenta mixture on every single cluster of leaves here. Then, as I do this, I add a small amount of blending to some of this new coat of paint with the background. Nothing really new here, except this time I really want to be careful with painting this tree. This tree in particular draws a lot of attention in this painting, and so we want to be very deliberate with painting with as much quality as possible. The last time I painted this, I didn't do it justice, so use precision here and be careful not to neglect the background leaves. Also, another important thing to remember is that this tree in particular has a slight gradient effect. The light on the right side of the tree is going to be brighter than on the left, as the sunlight's brilliance is coming from that nearby opening to the right, so your general trend of color value should be transitioning ever so slightly. A lot of new artists I see paint trees with leaf clusters that are too big or overcrowded, and there is not enough negative space between the leaves. It's important to not go overboard on painting these leaves here, as this tree isn't supposed to be as full of leaves as other trees are. So with the same magenta mixture, I'm also using it to add a few leaves here and there, and these will help serve as the background leaves. So once I get enough of that covered, I then switch to a slightly brighter mixture and start to add more texture over these chunks of paint. Try to keep them separated and continue using the same principles with partial blending and using a variety of shapes and sizes. And of course, remember to keep the brushing mostly horizontal. A good technique I like to use is when you use a fresh and wet mixture to paint these individual leaves, continue using this mixture all the way through, so that when it gets drier and less potent, use this drier mixture to help blend some of the leaves together. Make sure that the majority of this color is on the right side of the tree, as a diffused light source will be coming from the right. Leave some of the leaf clusters alone so we can preserve some of the leaves for the background. Also, go back once again to a darker mixture and go over some of the brighter leaves just for the sake of adding more layers. And then go back again to the bright mixture to stack more leaves on top of that. Remember that painting trees is all about layering. Remember also that the more outward the leaves are, the more vivid the color you can use so that the leaves can stand out and create that separation between the background and foreground. Notice how different this tree looks now compared to how it was before. The leaves look more refined and at the same time blend in better with the background. They almost seem to have a glow to them, and that's just another special thing about Kinkade's style of painting. I think I've shown you enough here. Let's move on. Going back to working on this foliage here as well as this flower patch, I'm using all the same principles from before. I'm using a slightly varying degree of orange here for the flowers and integrating that with the leaves in this bush. Also, remember that when you do paint very small flowers, don't just paint a bunch of dots, but when you brush them on the canvas, blend some of them ever so slightly into the background. This painting is really starting to take shape. So far, everything I'm painting is using all the same techniques I have demonstrated throughout this video, and am continuing to slowly build on everything I've established. As far as showing you any new techniques, there is one more thing I want to show you, and that is going to be finishing painting the water. So going back here, I use a very desaturated mixture of aquamarine. Instead of using gray to desaturate it, I use a very small amount of red. This helps preserve more of the pigmentation of the mixture and helps prevent it from looking too muddy. Right now I'm adding a second coat of paint over all the bluish areas, using some blending here and there, and I'm also being pretty loose with my painting. Don't be afraid of painting over many of the white areas, but when you do, use thinner layers of paint and try to add some textures with this mixture. Painting this will be very similar to painting the dirt path and bridge because of the texturing we'll be doing. So once I have covered this area, let's work on the shadowy parts of the water. Instead of using gray or black here, I'm mixing together the aquamarine color with a small amount of red, and the color actually turns out really dark, and try to err on the side of it being bluish green. I carefully go over the dark spots, and as I'm doing this, I go back and forth with the previous mixture to stack the paint here where the water ripples are in conjunction with the light parts and shadows. To be honest, I think this water is easier than other types to paint in landscapes because all you really have to worry about here is the textures of the splashes and a few water ripples here and there. I've painted other types of water. The way water works with reflections inside the waves and underneath the water itself is its own huge challenge and something I definitely need to make a separate video. Now I get a pure white mixture using titanium white and go back over these white areas. Same exact principle as with painting the road, stacking some white chunks of paint over the previous layer to add texture. The one thing that's different this time is adding a few very small clusters in some areas to indicate the mist and splash of the water. Just like with painting those small flowers earlier in the video, use partial blending but also preserving some of the individual components as well. I think you get the idea. So once again, I'm going over a few miscellaneous areas. I'm refining the details in the grassy area here, and this time really sharpening many of these spots where in my last video I established the baseline. One thing I would have done differently in the beginning is use a more desaturated color for the base colors here. The original green was too intense, and so I had to cover up more than I had expected in this part. Now I'm working on the details here by the bridge. The same principles apply for everything as before, but make sure to use more precision here. I'm using my detailer brush most of the time, making sure that these distant parts retain their quality. I'm going back to refine a large amount of vegetation by the sunlit opening, and continuing using my fine detailer brush most of the time. One thing I'm going back to do is fix the color saturation in some areas. I think I used too much color saturation here, even though the color chroma is still pretty low. When you have these distant objects that are very close to the sunlight, they're going to lose a lot of color, and so I'm going back with a slightly grayer mixture. Look at how far we've come in this painting. We have a huge array of different and colorful vegetation, lots of contrast going on, and how the bright light dramatically enters this landscape and then diffuses into a few areas. The really cool part about this painting is that I've shown you the building blocks about how to put all this together. Much of this painting is really doing the same thing over and over again, if you think about it. Painting a background, doing some blending, and then just texturing repeatedly until we finally can finish sculpting these elements. I know it can get monotonous at times, and that's why I always advise taking breaks between painting the different parts of this landscape. Let me show you now one more specific thing for this painting. I'm going to finish painting the sunlit area behind the trees. To paint the sun's rays shining through here, I'm mixing a heavy amount of medium with a small amount of white paint here. This is really easy to do and shouldn't take that long. The closer you get to the middle, you could add slightly more white paint to the mixture. As you paint these sun rays, blend the edges of these lines gently with the background. Now we can really see the brilliance of this focal point of the painting. So now, at this point of the video, I have shown you all the techniques and ways to paint that there is to show here. So let's go over what I've talked about. First, remember to use layering when it comes to painting all vegetation. This is going to vary depending on the type of plant life that you paint. With trees, you're of course going to use many layers because of the way the leaves come out from the back to the front. Second, you need to maintain a balance of blending and precision. When you paint vegetation, for example, remember to blend some of the parts of it like the leaves amongst each other, and leave some of them alone to look more realistic. There's two extremes here. If you blend too much, the painting will look too blurry and it won't look as dramatic and interesting. If you paint too precise everywhere, the painting will look too rigid and stiff. Third, remember to use proper saturation levels. Rarely do you ever need to use the original color straight from the tube. More often than not, you'll be mixing colors to one degree or another. In this case, less is more, so the vivid and bright colors that do appear will be that much more interesting to look at. Fourth, pay attention to the wetness of your brush. Depending on what you paint, you will require a certain amount of wetness or lack thereof to get the intended effect. These are just some points that I came up with as I have been working on this project. And believe me, this is quite the project. Not only painting, but editing the video and matching all this dialogue with the footage. I know that this project is indeed time consuming, and so if you did stick around all the way through this video, I want to thank you for taking your time to see part of my experience as an artist. I know that each person has their own style of painting, and that something else can work for another person. But regardless of where you come from, we as artists can share our experiences. Learning how to paint like another artist can be helpful in pushing yourself to the next level. I know that people say you're not supposed to compare yourself to others. So instead, I think you need to compare yourself to what you were yesterday. However, when it comes to striving for excellence in anything you do, I think it's a great idea to try to model after others before you. Studying other people's success habits helps you breed your own. I think that's where some artists get that wrong. I've come across artists that are high and mighty in their own individualism, that they fail to take any kind of criticism and neglect any self-evaluation. Study others, acquire what you admire. But we have reached the end, and of course, I have plenty of resources to go back to if you have any questions. If you found this video remotely helpful, please leave a comment and like the video. And with that said, I'll see you guys later.